Hello to my online learners. Today we look at the vascular system, chapter 16. What we're looking at is we're going to consider the blood vessels and also the pathway the blood takes. Now, often when we look at the three types of blood vessels, there are arteries, and arteries take blood away from the heart. Veins return it to the heart, and then the capillaries connect it. And as you look through it, you start with a big artery, the aorta, and then it goes down to arterioles, which is the smaller one, and then you start a smaller one, venules, and then you go up to the vein. Now, the structure of these is quite different. So this is looking at a cross-section of an artery and a vein. So this is an artery here, and then this is the vein here. You can tell the difference between them based on this muscular layer, because there's a big difference in the muscular layer. So there are three layers. The main one is an endothelial layer. You want it nice and smooth. And then you have the basement layer, which attaches the endothelium layer to the middle layer. The middle layer is where you have your your muscle layer. So if you can see, look how thick this is right here compared to the vein, which basically has very, very limited muscle layer. So you've got the middle layer is muscular, and then the outer layer is just connective tissue for strength, usually. Then around it, can you tell what these little bubbles are? This is adipose tissue to cushion, and also other connective tissue to hold it in. Now, the reason why the artery is so much thicker has to do with the blood pressure. The artery is taking blood away, and is taking blood away from the heart. And with the heart being the pump, it has the artery carrying blood under very, very high pressure. So as a result, you have very thick blood, very thick artery walls and very muscular artery walls. And they can expand and then release again. So they have elasticity, which helps them expand, and then they have something called compliance, which helps push the blood along when the heart isn't beating. So there's a stretch when the heart beeps, and then a shrinking, sort of a pushback when the heart relaxes. Okay, that is the artery, very much thicker. When you look at the vein down below, very thin, very little muscle in it, because by the time the blood goes to the capillary beds, their capillary beds are very small, but there are so many of them that the blood pressure will drop. And as it drops, it becomes very low. And it doesn't have that push, which helps move the blood through the veins. Okay, that gives you a good idea. So now we'll move back and look at a diagram of the blood vessel. And again, this one's thicker, so this is an artery. The internal one, the innermost layer, is simple endothelium or epithelium or endothelium, and that's because it lines the vessel. They're flat tissue, they're smooth, they're very, most of them are leak proof, because you want to keep everything moving smoothly so that nothing gets caught on it. Then the middle layer is the thickest layer in an artery, and it's composed of the smooth tissue, elastic tissue, and it allows the blood to change with diameter. It also allows the autonomic nervous system to cause vasoconstriction, and it will shut down or decrease the diameter of the blood vessel, or vasodilation, which allows for the diameter of the blood vessel to increase. And then you have this external layer, and this is strong but flexible connective tissue, and it's there to support it and also to anchor it to other things. Good. Arteries take away, as you mentioned. And I just want you to be aware that as the artery gets smaller, the muscle layer will get a little smaller. Then when we look at veins, veins also have 3 layers, but veins have the ability to stretch if the blood is pooling, but have almost no pressure change. So these have extensibility, they're able to extend, and they usually lie very close to the body's surface or close to a muscle. And the idea of the muscle, especially in your legs, is as the muscle contracts, it pumps and moves, it moves the blood from the vessels, in the blood vessels back to the heart. And valves are found in the veins. So veins have valves. And the whole idea of valves is one-way flow. So a little bit of push, a little bit farther up. And many valves, okay? Now, when we look at capillaries, capillaries are the only site of exchange. They're the only things thin enough. Everything else has this thick muscle layer, so they're mainly made to transport the blood. When you look at capillaries, they are usually only 1 cell thick with a basement layer. So you've got your endothelium, very thin cells. So this allows for very effective transport of the nutrients and gases through the blood vessel, the capillaries, okay? Now also too, as I mentioned, as the blood hits the capillaries, they are very small, but there's so many of them that the blood will slow down, which is kind of handy because the slowing of the blood allows for an increased time for exchange. Okay, we heard earlier, or read earlier, only 4% of all your blood's in the heart at one time when you're at rest. 13% in your brain. 60% is in your veins. So the veins are the largest place, and it can pool there and be stored there, and it needs to be moved back. Now, to help regulate the blood going through the capillaries, you may have heard of like capillary beds. And sometimes if you need a lot of blood in that area, you will open the capillary bed. And the example of this is when you are exercising and your body muscles need a lot of oxygen. The capillary beds will open by what's called this precapillary sphincter. So a sphincter is just another name for a circular muscle. They will relax, the sphincter will relax, and that will open the capillary bed, allowing for more blood to flow into the smaller capillaries. Then if you need it to close down, the precapillary sphincter will constrict, and when it constricts, it will have less go to the capillaries. You may notice this if you are a person who blushes easily. When I get hot, I get very red because that's my precapillary sphincters opening up to allow more blood to my face. And then when I'm colder, they shut down so that you have less blood going to your face. Here's a perfect example. During rest, 90% of your capillaries in your skeletal muscles are shut down. Okay, so this way it's a way of regulating how much blood goes to the area, and it's the precapillary sphincters. Now, capillary exchange is quite a confusing concept because there are 2 forces at it. One is the push out and the other is the pull back in. The push out is because of blood pressure. And the capillaries will release anything small out of their cells. And this includes oxygen, glucose, hormones, and nutrients. And then the capillaries, usually by concentration gradients take up waste, such as carbon dioxide and ammonia. And then these get transported around to the body. And water will move in and out of the capillaries based on constant or osmotic gradients. So when we're looking into the movement in and out of capillaries, usually it's diffusion. If there's a high concentration, say in the capillaries, as they go towards the tissues, there's a high concentration of oxygen. So the oxygen will move by, it's called a diffusion, it's called a concentration gradient, but truly because you're dealing with gases, you should be talking about partial pressure, which just is the fancy term for concentration gradient of gases. And then because you've got a large buildup of carbon dioxide in your tissue, by concentration gradient, the carbon dioxide will move out of your tissue and into your blood. Okay, let's explain a very complicated term called capillary exchange. This is the pressures that move the fluid out of the capillaries. They wash over the tissues around it and then pull the fluid, the extra fluid, back into the veins. So when you're looking at capillaries, capillaries are very thin and the tissues are quite close to them. The capillaries are still have some of the pressure from the contraction of the heart. So they are in pretty high pressure at the arterial end. As it goes through, it will lose its blood pressure, and at the venous end, it will have less blood pressure. That pushing of the blood pressure is called filtration. And filtration occurs closer to the arterial end, and then there's less filtration on the way at the end of the capillary. So the push out is filtration. Now, there's this other term which is quite confusing called colloid pressure, also sometimes called oncotic or osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure is the pull back in based on the fact that there is more, basically based on the property of osmosis. So as the fluid goes out into the tissue, there is more fluid in the tissue and less fluid in the capillaries. So because there is less fluid in the capillaries, it will pull it back in by oncotic pressure. So let's look at the diagram here. So as the blood pressure decreases over the capillary, it loses its prominence in the type of pressure that controls it. So there's always an oncotic pressure, a colloid osmotic pressure, and that's because of the proteins in the blood cell. We talk about this huge protein albumin. Because you have the proteins in the blood vessel, in the capillaries, it will pull the water back in because the fluid needs to go to places where there is less fluid. Remember how we talk about hypertonic and hypotonic? Well, the tissues outside will be filled with water. And then because they are filled with water, it picks up the waste, and then the water, so this area here, the fluid and the tissue, is now hypotonic because it has more water and less tissues, and less non-water particles. Then because of all the large proteins and the red blood cells, remember white blood cells can leave, red blood cells don't. So as a result, there will be this pull back in called colloid osmotic pressure, and this is due to the proteins in your blood that pull the fluid along, and that's what pulls the waste back in. Okay, very confusing because that pressure doesn't change much. So it remains the same, but because the blood pressure decreases, the osmotic pressure increases towards the venous end. So in the capillary end, in the arterial end, the pressure is greater. And the pressure due to blood pressure is pushing things out, causing filtration. As the blood pressure drops over the capillary, there is less pull, or less push out, so the pull back in becomes the greater force, and that's what draws the fluid back in. Very confusing. Pressure going out is blood pressure. The pull going back into the capillary is colloid osmotic pressure due to the presence of albumins or proteins in your blood. Okay, no problem. Very complicated. It's very complicated, but this is why if you don't eat enough protein, it can interfere with the process in your blood. Okay, let's look at circulatory rates. There is 3 circulatory patterns in your body. There's the pulmonary circulatory. There is, and pulmonary, remember, means lungs. So that's the one that goes out to the lungs. Then you have the systemic circulation, which goes out to the system, the rest of the system. And then, actually there's 4. The coronary one that goes to the heart, and the hepatic circulatory system that collects all the blood off the digestive organs and then shunts it to the liver for cleaning before it goes back into the circulation again. So let's look at the pulmonary one. We kind of looked at this when we looked at the heart. The blood is leaving the right ventricle. Remember, with reference to left and right, it's as in the person who's on your table, your patient. So you have it leaving the heart from the right side of the heart. It goes out to the pulmonary trunk. Then after the pulmonary trunk, it goes to the pulmonary arteries. Then the pulmonary arteries will divide and divide and divide again into pulmonary capillaries. Then the capillaries surround these small pockets in the lungs called the alveoli. And the alveoli is where they will pick up the carbon dioxide, drop off the oxygen and the other way. In the alveoli, they will pick up the oxygen and drop off the carbon dioxide. Now, notice that this is the blue blood. So a definition that some of you may have learned incorrectly is that arteries carry oxygenated blood. That is incorrect. The true and simplest definition of an artery is it carries blood away from the heart. So the pulmonary arteries the blood hasn't gone to the lung yet, so it hasn't been oxygenated. So this is the reason why they're blue. It's not oxygenated. The blood will pick up oxygen in the capillaries of the lungs, and then it will head back. And since it's going to the heart, it's veins. So it will head back in the pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart, collecting in the left aorta. And it's paralleled in each of your lungs. Systemic circulation is the set of vessels that carry the oxygen and nutrients to the rest of the body. Now, it is the oxygenated blood, so the oxygenated blood comes out of the left side or the left ventricle. Then it will come up the aorta. The aorta then bends at the aortic arch, and then it goes down in the descending aorta. So ascending means up, and then it's only the first few centimeters that come up, but the arteries that feed the heart, the coronary arteries, come off those first few right after the valve. They come right after the valve. So they come up to the top. Then there's 3 that come off the arch, and then it goes down. When it comes off the arch, it is the brachial cephalic, and this is where It sounds really complicated until you break the words down. Brachio means arm, cephalic means head. So the first one that comes off goes to the arm and the right side of your head. Then you've got the common carotid and then the subclavian. So I remember them alphabetically. B, C, S. Brachiocephalic, common carotid, and subclavian. Brachiocephalic, common carotid, subclavian. Okay. Now realize that after the brachiocephalic and the common, after the brachiocephalic divides again, this one becomes the right subclavian and the right common carotid artery. So there's like a little divider first. Brachiocephalic, common carotid, subclavian. And yes, you do need to know these ones. Then it goes down, goes behind the heart, and then goes down the descending aorta. Now, the descending aorta is a little trickier because we'll go to the arms later. The descending aorta is a little trickier because a lot that comes off, but usually the descending aorta has the organs on it, so it makes more sense. Then it comes down and it breaks. If you remember, the top bone of your hip is the ilium, so the iliac arch. So it separates at your hip to the left and right common iliac arteries. Okay, good. Initially, when looking at the blood vessels of the arm, it does look quite confusing, but most blood vessels are named about their location. So sub means below. Subclavian means below the clavicle. So the subclavian goes to your arm. So remember we had the three that came off, the brachiocephalic, common carotid, subclavian. Subclavian goes to the arm, below the clavicle. Then it comes down and then it becomes the axillary artery. And axillary means armpit. Then a couple of them branch off. I just want you to follow the main one, which is the branchial artery. And this is called the branchial. Remember how the top of your arm is branchial. Then by the radius is where you have the radial artery. And this is the one that you take the most, you take your pulse from. Your branchial artery is the one, your brachial artery is the one you take your blood pressure from, okay? So that pretty much, let's go to the top. Subclavian, axillary, branchial, and radial, okay? And it's based on where the location is. There was another one that in the textbook that looked at, oh, I'm thinking veins. Okay, good. Now let's look at your abdominal area. Now your abdominal area is usually easier if you know what your vessels look like. So this is your kidney. Kidney is renal. Anything go to your kidney is your renal artery. Then you've got the first one that come off is your gastric and your splenic and your hepatic. So these are the ones that go to your stomach is gastric, your spleen, and your liver. Then you've got your mesentery. Mesentery is just a word for gut. So you've got your superior mesentery, which comes off first, and your anterior mesentery, which comes off later. Realize that these ones in the abdomen will have the organs attached to them when you need to name them. Okay, and mainly we're going to look at the renal artery because that's really important when we talk about the functioning of the kidney. Good. Then you've got, as we divided before, once they divide up, they become the common iliac artery. Then, once it divides, the one that says outside is the external. The one that goes inside is the internal. The external is larger. Then, once we hit the femur, it becomes the femoral vein. Okay? Again, named after the location. So, It sounds tricky, but it's not as tricky as you'd think it would be. Okay, so you have your common iliac, then you have your external iliac, then you have your femoral. Once you get to the knee, it's the popliteal. Then you have your anterior tibular artery and your posterior tibiary artery and your posterior tibiary artery. Then you have the dorsal pedis artery. The dorsal pedis artery is the one that you take the pulse off in babies. Okay? Dorsalis pedis artery. That means dorsal means behind your leg. Pedis means foot. Okay? So again, they seem very complicated, but if you put them towards their location, it's not quite as complicated. And I'm going to leave off at the end of the arteries here, and I'll join you for the rest of the vessels in part 2.